This is a Miller philosopher. Anyone familiar with the character of Aragorn is familiar with the fate of the ancient northern Dunedain kingdom of Arnor, at least on a general basis. It was there then, it's not there now. End of story. Many hardcore fans are familiar with the details of its fall, that after the Second Age, the kingdom became divided into 3 separate realms due to infighting, and one by one they all fell to the Witch King of Angmar, with not but a little help from the Great Plague of the Third Age that depleted many populations across the world. For me, this then begs the question, what if these 3 realms never fell to Angmar? Or, the better question is, what if Arnor had never been separated into 3 smaller portions in the first place? Because there are major ramifications to this besides just a different version of how the War of the Ring plays out, I'm going to try and go through this in a little bit of detail, but not too deep that it just gives you a headache. I've said in an earlier video, which I'll leave a link to below, that Arnor represents the price of pride and arrogance, that its later descendants, the Dunedain Rangers, inherited a brutally forced lesson in humility that was passed down by their ancestors that survived the Angmar Wars. Essentially, that just because you might be superior or think you are, doesn't mean you treat other people like they are somehow lesser than you or treat them as basically an inferior species of some sort, something that Gondor was frequently guilty of. And speaking of Gondor, it looked down on Arnor and its smaller parts because it seemed so isolated and pretty much a petty realm in their eyes, especially after it was divided, and served no real importance beyond being distantly related. They were in an area that they had no interest in, so they basically, for the most part, didn't bother with them. This is very similar how in the real world, the Eastern/Byzantine Roman Empire saw the Western Roman Empire, basically as a backwater region that had no real significance anymore. So, the first change that would have happened is that Arnor would not learn this lesson in humility. Had the sons of the 10th and last king of Arnor, Arnor, worked out whatever differences they had and remained united, Arnor would have remained just as proud as Gondor, but for different reasons. Gondor's pride didn't just come from its Numenorean lineage, but also that it was an expanding empire to the south and east of Middle-earth. And if the later succession crisis of 1945 of Third Age shows anything, it was that the Lords of Gondor cared more for their more recent history than their ancient one. A united Arnor, however, has no room to really expand, even if they never separated, being hemmed in by the Elves of Lindon to the west, the Misty Mountains to the east, and Rivendell a little bit to the south, and Gondor to the far south as well. So therefore, there were no enemies to take land from unless the kings decided to make new ones from old allies. And this then bleeds into the second major change, that Arnor would have withstood the armies of Angmar. Of course, the Witch King was hell-bent on destroying it, but it took him centuries and a plague before he could have actually achieved this goal in the main timeline. So, how much more difficult would it have been if Arnor had remained together during this entire time? Even if we include the plague, which I would. Because of its distance from the harder hit portions of the south, Arnor would have withstood it better than Gondor did. And because it's been united, its populations would have more support. Moreover, I think that both realms would have come to the same conclusion as well that they do in the actual timeline, that some greater power is trying to take down the descendants of Numenor. Still, a more powerful Arnorian army, combining with the Elves of Lindon and Rivendell and Gondor, would just result in the same conclusion of crushing Angmar, just even more so. However, what would be interesting about this would be the fallout. Barring any kind of trade that would have been going on between the sister realms, the war would have been the first major interaction between the two realms since the end of the Second Age. There would have still been talks of reuniting the kingdom, and still the hesitation and denial from Gondor, but also that Gondor would have been forced to recognize that their northern neighbors were their equals, not some distant country bumpkins that lived far to the north. This essentially would have made it harder for Gondor to dismiss any claim from Arnor, because it may have actually resulted in an increased military presence along their northern borders, because of the fact that, again, their cousins of the north were not weak, and they may be afraid of them actually invading in order to force the change. That being said, it probably wouldn't happen that way, since Rivendell, I'm sure, would have sorted things out, since it's right along their borders. They actually got into a northern war. And a war between the descendants of the Dunedain is the last thing anyone in that area wants. Arnor would have completely changed the game of the Third Age from this point on, because now there are 4 major powers that Sauron's proxies would have to deal with instead of just 2. And Arnor being the most difficult one, arguably, because it's much harder to reach, if not impossible, thanks to the fall of Angmar, similar to the role the Númenóreans played during the Second Age with the War of the Elves and Sauron, that the Númenóreans could just keep sending over soldiers, while Sauron, who had no navy and whose armies were afraid of water for their part, would have been completely unable to do anything about Númenor. That being said, Gondor will not submit to Arnor no matter what. That's just a given. But the plague, however, would have left them in a much more vulnerable position, a weaker army, not to mention their ongoing wars that was starting to sway against them elsewhere. I think that when the war happens with the Easterlings, which results in the Battle of Celebrant, that results in the current King of Gondor dead, and the result of the creation of Rohan, thanks to their saving the Gondorians at the last minute, that Rohan may actually have been used as a buffer state against Arnor, not to start a war, mind you, but just in case Arnor starts getting ideas, if you know what I mean. And when the Umbar Easterling invasion happens in 1158, Arnor is going to be there to back up both Rohan and Gondor, leading to less losses and perhaps even the preservation of the line of Helm Hammerhand. There is a whole reservoir of manpower and material and food that can help support Rohan and Gondor, which would be under siege at this point, whereas before there was really nothing to the north to support them per se, especially during the long winter. It's also worth mentioning too that the Misty Mountains War between the Dwarves and the Orcs would still happen, but there may be some negotiations involved between the Dwarven army coming from the west that passes through Arnor with such a large army. Assurances that they're not planning on starting a war with Arnor, because an army of that size doesn't go by unnoticed. And any orcs fleeing from the Dwarves in the aftermath of that war would have been annihilated between Arnor, Rohan, and Rivendell. Essentially, Arnor would become, by the time of the latter portions of the Third Age, the most powerful player in the game, due to the fact that it's isolated and basically can't be reached. They can supply troops and supplies to Rohan and Gondor when they need it. If they wanted to go or expand eastward, the mountains would still be a problem. Could an Arnorian army cross over the Misty Mountains and then therefore expand further east? Potentially. But there's also reasons why Morgoth raised those mountains in the Primordial era of Arda. Even by the Third Age, the Misty Mountains are a dangerous and deadly place if you're not careful. Gondor would still become weaker by the latter portions of the Third Age, and, though perhaps not invaded and conquered by Arnor, may still end up being a proxy to them politically and militarily. And the possibility of a return of a king to a united Dunedain kingdom would happen differently than it does in the main timeline, as I alluded to at the beginning of this video. With after the death of the last king of Gondor and its further waning afterwards, that its lords may simply decide that it's better to be allied with someone who they somewhat know than be defeated and annihilated by their enemies. That essentially, they would become forced to recognize the same thing that Arnor did in the main timeline, when they were in that very position. So when I look at things this way, from this perspective, I can see now why Sauron would want to take out Arnor first. It would have been a hindrance to his plans that he could not touch if he could not take them out somehow. And also too, it also makes it really suck that the three sons of Arendir, who were responsible for separating up Arnor in the first place, didn't have this foresight to put aside their differences, because that's what sets the downfall of Arnor into motion. Of course, this also would probably go against Tolkien's moral theme for Lord of the Rings, but that's just how I see things playing out if a united Arnor had remained in play. But whether you think this is true, or whether you have your own ideas or just disagree with this, let me know in the comments below. This is the Middle-earth Philosopher, and you guys have a good day.